The garage door stood wide open. I stood quietly in the kitchen, the coffee cup in my hand cooling. Through the window frame, I saw the early sunlight flood into the empty space where the Mustang had once sat, the car that Richard, my husband, had spent 20 years restoring. Every bolt, every stroke of paint, his love, now it was gone. My son, David, had sold it for a trip to London with his wife, without a single word of warning. Then, the next morning, a phone call changed everything. The man said he was holding the car, and Richard had left something just for me. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old this year, and have spent over 40 years as a nurse. After Richard died, I thought nothing could stir my heart again. But I was wrong. This story isn't just about the car. It's about loyalty, betrayal, and love that endures beyond death. Richard saved me, even when he was no longer here. Before I go on, please leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if you believe that the best chapters of life can come after age 60, hit subscribe to the Silent Elderly Stories channel. Our community always welcomes you. I discovered it first. The garage door was open. It had never happened before. 43 years together with Richard, he never left the garage door open overnight. I stood in the kitchen, barefoot, the coffee cup ice cold. Through the glass pane above the sink, early sunlight streamed in, but it didn't shine on the car arch like every other day. Just a silent emptiness. The Mustang was gone. I walked into the backyard. The April air is cool. Richard would usually be out there early, bent over the car, an oily rag in hand, classic rock on the old radio. Now only the familiar oil stain on the cement remained, and the cold void where the car once sat. I opened the toolbox. Everything was precisely as Richard had left it. Teehee red tool chest closed tight, the pegboard with every wrench outlined carefully in black marker. The repair journal was still open, the last entry shaky but full of hope. Almost done. Can't wait to teach Margaret how to drive this baby. Next summer, we'll begin our retirement road trip. I set the notebook down, my heart heavy. Then I heard a car pull into the driveway. The black BMW, David's. A rental, not purchased. He used to boast that. David stepped out, his eyes avoiding me. Behind him was Emily, his wife. Neat, flawless, wearing sunglasses. Her jacket must have cost as much as a month of my pension. "David," I asked plainly, "where's the car?" He was silent for a moment, then, "I sold it?" At first, I didn't understand. My brain refused to process the words. "I needed the money," David said, voice low. "Emily has this big business trip to London. I didn't want to let her down." I clenched both hands to hide the trembling. "That was your father's car. He's been gone less than a year, and you sold it?" "It was just sitting there, Mom." "Dad's gone. You never drove it anyway. They offered good money." "How much?" $15,000. I could scarcely breathe. Richard has been assembling every bolt for 20 years, polishing every detail. A restored vintage Mustang made perfect for $15,000. Emily interjected, placing her hand over David's, red-painted nails obvious. "Carol, it's done. Mom should understand we have to move on." I looked at her. Cold, no emotion, a smile without spirit. "This is between me and my son. David is my husband. Whatever affects him affects me too." I turned away, my heart sinking. I had lost Richard, and now, perhaps, I had just lost David too. I returned to the garage after David and Emily left. The door was still open, sunlight shining directly into the gap where the car once lay. The oil stain on the cement was like an unhealed wound. Richard's scent was still there. Engine oil, old leather, and that orange-scented hand wash he always used. I closed my eyes, imagining him sitting there, sleeves rolled up, brow furrowed, inspecting some part, singing along to an old song on the radio. The Mustang wasn't just a car. It was Richard's soul, 20 years. Every weekend he was in here. Patient. Careful. I moved to the workbench. The journal was still open, the last page shaky but full of hope. Almost finished. We'll teach Margaret to drive in June, our first summer of retirement. I placed my hand on those words, tears falling before I knew it. Richard had plans. For us. For the future. I must now take him alone for the final journey of his life. I stepped out of the garage, but did not close the door. I wanted the light to remain shining in there, as though Richard was still here, still finishing what he didn't get to complete. The phone rang at 7 a.m. the next day. I had been awake since 4, unable to sleep. Richard's journal lay open on the kitchen table. I kept reading the same page over and over. The call came from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't pick up. Mrs. Margaret Turner? A male voice, hoarse and trembling slightly, as though he'd just cried. My name is Tom Whitaker, from Whitaker Classic Motors. I have your husband's Mustang. I leaped up from the chair. What? What did you say? Your son David brought the car here on Wednesday. I bought it. But after checking the chassis number, I recognized it was Richard's. I need you to come to the workshop. Right now if you can. There's something he wanted you to know. I froze. My heart is pounding wildly. Who are you to Richard? A friend, Tom's voice caught. A friend he saved 25 years ago. I vaguely remember. A gray-haired man stood quietly at the back of the funeral parlor, then left before I could speak. Tom read the address. I hurriedly wrote it on the back of an envelope, then said, I'll be there within 30 minutes. I pulled on jeans, a sweater, and found the keys. I drove through the city in the morning. Traffic was light, and a thin mist still hung. I drove past the hospital where I had worked for 40 years, past the roads Richard used to drive me on for leisurely rides. Tom's workshop was at the end of a quiet road in the middle of an industrial zone. A large iron gate, a faded turquoise sign, Whitaker Classic Motors, vintage cars, real value. Tom was standing out in the yard. He looked about 60, with salt and pepper hair, and was wearing a striped shirt. His eyes were red. Thank you for coming, he said, shaking my hand, his palm trembling. I'm Tom Whitaker, and I owe your husband everything. We sat down in the small office. On the desk was a half-drunk coffee and an old photograph. Richard and Tom standing by another old car, both young and smiling broadly. 25 years ago, I had nothing but a dream of opening a vintage car workshop. No bank would lend. Richard was the only one who trusted me. He signed as guarantor, risked everything for a man he barely knew. I paid off the debt, but the debt of gratitude never goes away. His voice caught. Richard said, if anything ever happened to him, I need to make sure Margaret knew. There was something he hid, because he wanted to protect you. I held my breath. What is it? Tom stood. I'll show you. We walked into the garage at the rear of the workshop. High ceilings, bright white lights. 3 vintage cars covered in tarps stood quietly. Tom pulled the tarp off the last one. The Mustang. The midnight blue paint gleamed, chrome sparkling, still intact like the last day I saw it. I walked up and placed a hand on the hood. Cold, smooth, familiar. Richard asked me to help install a secret compartment behind the radio. He said, if anything happened, I am the only one to tell you. I trembled as I stepped forward. Tom showed how to remove the radio face. Press 2 points, twist lightly. A small panel popped open. Inside was an envelope, a thick file, and a small wooden box. It said Margaret on the envelope, in a handwriting I knew better than my own. He wanted you to read it yourself. Tom stepped back. I'll leave you alone. I trembled in the driver's seat and opened the envelope. Margaret, if you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer with you. I'm sorry I hid this while I was alive, but I needed to make sure there was proof to protect you. And, David, Emily is not who you think she is. She's done this before. Twice. In this file is everything. I opened the yellow file. The papers inside aged. Some pages even stained with engine oil. Surely Richard had been reading and making notes in this garage for countless nights. At the top of one page, he had written in blue pen, his familiar slanted script, Olivia Chambers. Real name, Olivia Renault. Investigation begins, January 2022. Inside were various documents carefully arranged, marriage certificates, snapshots, and newspaper clippings from multiple states. There was a photo of Olivia standing beside an older man at a wedding in a small town in New Mexico. Then another photo of her, with the same sweet smile that once made me weak, but this time at a charity event in Miami, arm in arm with another man, also with salt and pepper hair. I turned through each page. The first evidence was 2 marriage registrations named Olivia Renault, one marrying Thomas Greer 2017 in Santa Fe, and one marrying Charles Winthrop 2019 in Jacksonville. Both men were widowers, caring for elderly parents or owning significant assets. Richard had also written beside it. Both men reported losing their entire savings within 6 months of marriage. Olivia disappears, leaves no trace. A chill ran down my spine. Richard's investigation was no longer a suspicion. It was manifest in every line, every detail. Behind the file were his handwritten notes. Richard documented all of Olivia's suspicious actions during the time she lived with our family. Olivia asked Margaret about her medication routines. Olivia asked David about the will. Olivia went into my study uninvited when no one was home. June, she left a flyer about a nursing home on the kitchen table. I recalled that flyer. At the time, I thought it was just an ad delivered by mistake. I'd thrown it away. Richard also wrote, Olivia is constructing the image that Margaret is weakening, needs a caregiver. Plan as in previous cases. Get mother into nursing home, manipulate son into selling the house, take money, disappear. I saw a sheet listing websites and articles Olivia had visited. Richard had printed them from our home computer history. Titles included, How to Persuade an Elderly Relative to Move House, How to Secure Legal Guardianship for Parents, Real Estate Values in Suburban London. My heart pounded. She had her eye on our home, the house Richard and I built together over 43 years. At the end of the file was a business card. Peter Cole, private investigator. Richard's final note, coordinating with Peter to gather further corroborating evidence. Not enough to prosecute yet. If I can't act in time, Margaret must know everything. Tom will help. I leaned back in the chair, tears falling unceasingly. Richard had quietly protected me while fighting his terminal cancer. He never told me because he didn't want me to worry, because he needed to make sure everything was true before dragging me into it. My finger lightly touched the last line he wrote in red ink, standing out. If you're reading this, finish the job I couldn't. Save our son. I closed the file, hugged it to my chest, feeling Richard's heart still beating with mine. Beside me was the small wooden box. I opened it. Inside was a bank key card, the card reading, Safety Deposit Box number 231, First Union Bank, and a final note. Inside is everything I left for you. You are not alone. You have power. You have the truth. Now you can protect David as I tried. 2. On Monday morning, I went to First Union Bank. London was still chill, though spring, with light drizzle on my wool coat sleeves. I walked in with a strange sensation. Not fear, but profound gratitude. Richard was still here. Somehow, he was still leading me on. The bank manager, a middle-aged woman wearing glasses, her gaze professional yet warm, checked the papers and led me to the safety deposit vault area. The hallway was long, with steel walls and cold white fluorescent lights. She used the bank key, and I used Richard's key to open box number 231. The door popped open, and inside was a thick envelope carefully wrapped in a moisture barrier bag. I brought it to the desk and sat down, my hands trembling as I opened it. Inside was a portfolio of tech stocks, encased in plastic, along with a handwritten letter from Richard, his familiar slanted handwriting. Dearest Margaret, if you hold this file, I am no longer by your side. But don't be sad. Everything I have done is so you can live a free life, dependent on no one. In 1994, a patient, Mr. James Poole, asked me to invest in his son's company. They needed a few people they could trust. I put in $3,000 thinking I would never see it again. But I believed in the person more than the numbers. The company is called Cortex Systems. They spent almost 30 years developing, and they officially went public last year. I checked. This shareholding is now worth over $250,000. I kept quiet, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to give you a surprise gift in case one day I couldn't be with you any longer. You have sacrificed too much for the family, for me. Now it's time you live your own life. No more worry, no seeking permission. Use this money to keep the house that has held our life together. Or travel, take a cooking class, or simply enjoy your morning coffee without considering the utility bills. You have strength, you have a choice, and you have my love in every part of this. Forever yours, Richard. I sat motionless. For the first time in many months, I felt a new emotion, hope. I carried the documents to the trading room. The manager checked, typed on the keyboard, then looked up, eyes full of surprise. Mrs. Bennett, this stock is worth about $267,000 according to this morning's market value. Would you like us to produce a detailed valuation and provide further investment advice? I nodded quietly, still hesitant to believe the number. Richard and I had lived modestly all our lives, never daring to dream of that amount. The manager offered a small smile. Your husband did this very carefully. The shares are held in your name. No one else has usage rights. This is a very substantial gift. I left the bank with a neat file in my bag. But what I carried home was more than money. It was independence, a shield to protect this house, and to protect David from Olivia. That afternoon, I arranged to meet with Peter Cole, the private investigator Richard had once hired. He was calm, spoke little, but every word carried weight. I told him about the money, about the evidence Richard had left. Peter paused a moment, then said, "You are no longer alone. Now we have two things: proof that she has repeated the scam pattern, and finance to act without being pressured by your son. The key now is to make David see the truth. But he must discover it himself. You can't just tell him." I understood. Part of my heart still wanted to protect David from hurt. But now, I needed to rescue my son, as Richard once tried to. I placed my hand on the file bag, filled with resolve. Olivia will get nothing more. Not money, not the house, and my son. I arranged dinner for Thursday. It was not a special occasion. I simply told David I missed him and wanted to hear about his London trip. My son agreed at once. Still the gentle David. Only now his gaze always sought Olivia for reassurance. They arrived at precisely 6 o'clock as usual. Olivia appeared in an ivory silk dress, hair tied low deliberately, light makeup, but enough to show she'd spent hours preparing. The Rolex on her wrist gleamed, not a fake. We ate dinner in a polite but somewhat awkward atmosphere. I cooked the stew Richard used to like. David recalled the times father and son cooked together. Olivia smiled gracefully, her eyes never leaving me. Mid-meal, she began. "Margaret, we are really concerned for you. This house is too large, too much work. Have you ever considered selling it and moving to a more manageable apartment?" David looked at me expectantly. I put down my spoon and smiled. Thank you for your concern, but I am perfectly capable of living here. In fact, this morning I climbed up on the roof to check the gutters. Olivia raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. I turned to David. Do you have some spare time? I found some things among your father's things. Perhaps you should take a look. David nodded. I got up, led my son into the study, leaving Olivia alone in the living room. On the desk was a slim file, not the investigation file, but a copy of the registration papers for your father's vintage car and the current valuation, $180,000. David sat down, flipped through. I said quietly, Your father wanted you to inherit that car. He believed you would understand and appreciate his work. David stiffened. Mom, I just thought it wasn't worth anything. I remained silent. No need to say more. At that moment, Olivia called from downstairs. David, I'm going to check the upstairs study a little. I stood up, gestured silently to David. Then I went upstairs and stood outside their father's old study. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Olivia opened a drawer and pulled out an envelope of documents. She had no idea I was standing behind the door. To see what that old lady is hiding, she muttered. I pushed the door fully open. What are you looking for, Olivia? She jumped, spun round, her face pale momentarily, but she quickly regained her composure. Oh, I got lost. If I recall correctly, you told me the restroom is upstairs. I folded my arms. The restroom is downstairs, and you were snooping in my husband's desk drawer. Olivia stepped forward, smile frozen. Margaret, maybe you're imagining things. This idea, it's not very healthy for someone your age. I looked directly into her eyes. Did you forget I was a nurse for 40 years? I know the difference between confusion and full awareness. The air in the room thickened. She went silent, then shifted her gaze, regained her composure. I think we should be going. Oh, by all means, I said. But remember, everything you do in my house is recorded by the cameras Richard installed. I only hope you haven't erased all the evidence. Olivia's face froze. She pulled out her phone, typed quickly, then called David. Let's go, darling. David ascended, his eyes torn between the two of us. Olivia draped her arm over his and brushed past me. You should rest, Margaret. It seems you're under too much stress. I smiled. And you should brace yourself. The truth is very near, Olivia. They left. But this time Olivia walked quickly, no longer the leisurely, confident figure she had been. She knew. I was not the naive old woman she once assumed. The next day, I called Peter Cole, Richard's private investigator. After last night's events, I believed I had every reason to act. Peter answered immediately, as though waiting for my call all week. I've gathered additional documents from 2 of Olivia's former victims, Peter said, and I just received notification from the London police. Her real name is Linda Holmes. She's wanted in 2 U.S. states for fraud and asset misappropriation via marriage. Olivia was just another alias. I closed my eyes and drew a deep breath. What do we need now to charge her legally? Your son's testimony, the bank statements, and the camera footage if you do indeed have it. I did. Richard had installed the camera system after a minor burglary in the neighborhood. I'd never touched it, thinking I didn't need to. Now it has become gold evidence. That afternoon, I called David in. My son came alone, his face tired, sleep-deprived. I knew he was doubting, torn, but I also knew he needed the truth more than ever. I sat across from him and gave David the investigation file on Olivia, the camera footage, and Richard's handwritten original letter. David was silent for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. I didn't know. I feel ashamed, Mom. I betrayed Dad, betrayed you. I believed someone who was a total stranger over our own family. I laid my hand on his. No. You were just a victim of someone very skilled at manipulation. Your father knew that. That's why he didn't blame you. He only wanted to protect you." We sat there, saying nothing further. Silence, but no longer a gap between us. At that moment, I felt Richard's presence all around, within the walls, in the kitchen light, in the slight breeze from the cracked window. The next day, David officially signed a cooperation statement with the police. He provided all evidence of unauthorized spending, including credit cards opened without his knowledge. Within 48 hours, an international arrest warrant was issued for Linda Holmes. 2 weeks later, she was arrested at Heathrow Airport trying to board a flight to Argentina with a fake passport. All of David's account assets were temporarily frozen for investigation. With Peter and the police cooperating, the matter went quickly. Meanwhile, David moved back home to live with me for some time. At first, just a few days, but then weeks. We reorganized the garage. David restored Richard's workbench. I fetched my husband's journal, which he used to chronicle the restoration of his vintage Aston Martin. Each page carried a piece of him, detailed instructions, witty notes, and entries like confidences to the future. One June afternoon, David said, "Mom, I want to learn how to maintain the car. I want to understand why Dad loved it so much." I nodded, tears in my eyes. "We'll do it together." Though not as complete as before, my family mended itself from the cracks. No more Olivia, no more doubt. Only my son and me and the things father and son once cherished. One clear Saturday morning, I heard the familiar sound, the engine's deep, steady rumble, echoing like Richard's voice reading aloud in the living room. I went out onto the front porch. My heart was pounding. The silver-gray Aston Martin DB5 rolled slowly into the driveway in sunlight, its hood gleaming like molten metal. The driver was Tom, the old friend of Richard's, wearing a worn shirt, offering a warm smile when he spotted me. "Putting her back where she belongs," he said, stepping out and handing me the keys. I stood still for a moment. My fingers touched the leather key fob Richard had used, now worn but still strong like his love for the family. Unfussy, silent, yet enduring. David emerged from the garage. When he saw the car, his eyes lit up, then welled with tears. I didn't think I'd ever see it again. Tom looked at David and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your father didn't let her go far. He did everything to keep the car because he believed one day you'd understand and come back." David bowed his head, trying to hide his emotion, but I saw his hand trembling as he opened the car door and settled into the driver's seat. The garage was already open. Tom and David backed the car into its old spot, where the oil stain still formed its elliptical ring on the concrete. The door closed. A sliver of light from the roof slit glowed onto the glossy paint like crystal. No one said a word, but I knew the house was whole again, not with things, but with feeling. That afternoon, David brought out Richard's journal onto the table. My son and I worked together on the machinery, changed the oil, and cleaned the windows. Each task connected 3 people, past, present, and future. Later that evening, I made the beef stew that Richard loved. David helped chop carrots and potatoes and make the salad. Small things that carried the flavor of days gone by. The atmosphere in the house was lighter, gentler. The cold void was gone. Before bed, David paused before the photo of his father hanging in the hallway. He stood there for a long time, then whispered, "I'll take care of Mom, take care of the garage and the car. I promise." I stood in the dark, silent, just nodded gently, letting the tears fall quietly. Richard had done what no one else could. He protected me, even when he was gone. And now, the Aston Martin was no longer just a vintage car. It became a symbol of love, trust, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of a family that knew how to rise after falling. Tomorrow, I will learn to drive it, just as Richard wrote. On Sunday morning, I stood in the garage, the keys in my hand. My son sat in the passenger seat, smiling quietly, exactly like young Richard used to. Feeling confident, Mom? I inhaled deeply, remembering the words my husband wrote in his journal. Before driving, check the oil. Make sure you're ready. The car will take you far, only if you believe you can. I started the engine. The roar was not just machinery, but the sound of 20 years of love, patience, and hope. We drove slowly down the sunlit street, the wind flowing through the slightly open window. Past the hospital where I used to work, the playground where David played as a kid, the streets are etched with a lifetime of memory. When we returned to the garage, I turned the engine off, removed the keys, and smiled. Richard would be proud, David whispered softly. Not just of me, I replied, of you too. And that is my story. I want to ask you, if your child sold the most precious thing belonging to a loved one who's passed, could you forgive? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you feel this story has touched your heart, please click subscribe so you don't miss more emotional journeys ahead. Never too late. It's never too late to live a whole new chapter.